Good evening, and welcome to another brutal episode of Diatribes from the voice of doom. Now here's your bucolic and bulimic host, voice of doom. Hello. Alright, I am going to do another one. And I figured another disaster would befall us by today. And I was right. I do want to add an addendum to my last couple of diatribes where I was describing the media as I understood them throughout my life. And I always remember something I wanted to say afterwards. And since I don't write things down and I don't plan very well, I forgot to mention probably my favorite news commentary show of all time. And it was the McLaughlin Group with John McLaughlin. Loved the guy. I loved his attitude. He was an in-your-face know-it-all, but he did it well. The way he did it was just entertaining. He'd have his panel. They'd have their roundtable discussion. And they'd discuss the current events. And McLaughlin was always like, he always had nicknames for all of his people. He'd like, what's the cause for... Oh, he'd have this deep voice. What's the cause for the current budget deficit we're experiencing? Freddie the Beetle Barnes. I think it's fiscal irresponsibility. Wrong. Morton Kondracki. I think it's not enough taxes. Wrong. Eleanor. He'd never have a nickname for her. Eleanor Clift. Couldn't stand her. It's all the Republicans' fault. They're all devils, and the Democrats can do no wrong, and if the Democrats could just do everything they wanted to, we'd have a perfect world. Wrong! So I loved him. He never really came up with the right answer, but he thinks he knew it, and he'd always tell all the panelists that they were wrong. So I loved McLaughlin. I miss him. Wish we had more people like him around. Okay, so let's move on to another subject. Okay, didn't know really how I wanted to approach this particular issue that has reared its ugly head. But I will say that the trifecta of every major dystopian novel ever written has now come true. We have 1984 by George Orwell. It was such a unique book that they actually made an adjective out of his last name. It's Orwellian. You talk about disinformation and confusion and things changing, and you don't really know which way is which, because they not only change what's happening now, but they change what happened in the past, and they rewrite everything with disinformation and misinformation. So that's very appropriate to today's age. I'm sure Orwell would roll around in his grave going, I cannot understand these people. The other book would be Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. That is coming true. If you watch some of this stuff, like Redacted and stuff, it talked about the WEF talking about changing the very nature of humanity by allowing them to interface with the database and interface with robots and interface with AI, where they will track every thought in your head and you'll be able to do things with your brain instead of using that primitive point and click method or touch screen. How insanitary can you get? You will merely use your mind to scroll up and down your web page. So that's very much like Brave New World, where they wanted to, well, that they did make humankind into test tube babies. They were all genetically engineered. Okay. The third one has come to pass. Great book, Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange. We saw it on the video, on the body cam footage of the 4 police officers, and I use that term loosely, beating on a civilian, beating on a citizen until he was dead. And that is very much like Clockwork Orange, where the scene where little Alex comes out of prison all reformed, and he starts getting beaten up by a bunch of old men that he had beaten up previously. And then 2 cops come to his rescue, and they turn out to be his old droogies, his old buddies from the gang. They were now cops. It was just ironic that Burgess would, blur the distinction between a vicious gang and police enforcement. Got to read the book. Read all 3 if you haven't already. It's a must. I insist you do it. So, the hardest one to read is 1984. It's very dense, but not that long. Brave New World, easy read. Clockwork Orange is funny. I read that, and I had seen the movie, but when I read it, I'm trying to figure out what all these words mean, because he writes in a whole bunch of jargon and slang that is supposed to be, mid-21st century slang. And I'm finally figure out what all the words finally mean through my own deduction. I get to the end of the book and find out there's a glossary at the end. So I could have saved myself a lot of time, but I think I learned more by figuring it out by myself. I'm a genius that way. So I'll just do a cursory comment on the footage of the footage being driven into people's heads. Interesting, because media, since I was on the subject of the media, are just ham-fisted rabble-rousers. There's going to be a video coming out at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard or Eastern Standard Time, and it's horrific, and it's the worst one ever in the history of police enforcement, so we don't want you to go out there and riot now, but this is the worst video ever, and when you see it, you're going to be appalled. But don't go out there and riot now. Please don't go out there and riot, even though we have our camera crews already in Memphis. So come on. That's getting a little bit obvious and a little bit disgusting. And they're pompous and pious about it, like, please don't go and riot. All right. There weren't that many riots. Why weren't there that many riots? Well, for one thing, they had already arrested the officers and charged them with multiple crimes, including second-degree murder. So it's not that effective to demonstrate for something that's already happened. The second reason is because the racial disparities and animosities are being blurred and confused, because it was definitely black on black crime. Only we can call it blue on black crime. We called this one black and blue because the guy was beyond black and blue. He was dispatched by law enforcement because they had a bone to pick, and they were just going to take their aggressions out on one guy and beat him to a pulp until he was dead. So they will face the music. Now, I didn't spend too much time watching the body cam footage because it was confusing, and I'm not going to retread the same stuff that everybody else talks about, but I did notice that there was one white cop in that group. I believe I noticed that. And he or she, possibly a she, could be either, or transitioning, was standing back, wasn't going to get involved in this beating because I think they know Whitey and the Caucasoids have learned their lesson about beating up on anybody, because they know they'll take the fall for everything. So 5 blues of color beat up and kill a person of color. And the ironies are so many and so thick, and you can discuss it any which way you want, but if they're going to have a police state, they're going to have to be a little bit more genteel about it. And these blueies were impunicrits of the highest order because they know they're recording themselves. And yet they still go crazy and beat somebody. Now, we'll see what happens. Could be another distraction. They could have all been hypnotized. Just like the guy who kneeled on the guy's neck might have been hypnotized. I do not discount hypnotism. And the MK Ultra stuff they do in the CIA just to make things happen. There's a big story behind that and conspiracy theories, but I don't discount hypnotism. And I don't want to say too much about it. What else did I want to say that was ironic? Not a whole lot. People's response is predictable. They're all aghast, they're all appalled, and they're glad that justice is taking its course. And we'll see what happens. I'm surprised they're not rioting because they're saying, well, why'd you arrest the black cops? You didn't arrest the white cops right away when they beat up on somebody. That's not fair. But apparently that little wrinkle didn't occur to anybody. Might be discrimination about this cop business. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a short one. I didn't have much to say and I didn't plan it. But I got to throw my 2 cents in, even though it's not even worth 2 cents. And we'll see how things develop. It'll be a long time before there's any further action on that particular crime. So thanks everybody, and I'll call it a day. It's only 12 minutes this time. Just enough for you to fall asleep to. All right, thanks, and see you next time.